Good afternoon. Welcome again. My name is Kristen Clark. I'm the President and Executive Director of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. We thank you for joining us today. We've been hosting a series of these webinars in the post-election period to provide updates to the public on where we are. And I am pleased and honored to be joined today by an exceptional lineup of panelists, including Derek Johnson, President and CEO of the NAACP. Thanks for joining us, Derek. We are also joined by Vinita Gupta, President and CEO of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. Welcome, Vinita.
Thank you so much, Kristen.
And also joined by Ezra Rosenberg, my colleague who co-directs the Voting Rights Project at the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. Welcome to Ezra.
Thanks, Kristen.
So this webinar is aimed on focusing on where we are today on November 20th, about 2.5 weeks out from the conclusion of the November 3rd general election. I want to open the conversation by providing some preliminary top level observations about where we are. First, our organization leads Election Protection, the nation's largest and longest running nonpartisan voter protection program. And between January 1st and Election Day, we received over 225,000 calls to the 866 Our Vote hotline. We heard from voters who experienced barriers to mail ballots, voters who had trouble accessing drop boxes, voters who encountered intimidating individuals, reports of robocalls, trouble meeting notary and witness requirements, and more. We did not receive a single claim of fraud, not one. There has been no evidence of election irregularities, which are the purported purpose underlying many of the post-election lawsuits that we have been up against. Many of the lawsuits that we have seen filed by President Trump and his allies since Election Day have been meritless. We are at a period where we are dealing with meritless post-election litigation, futile recounts intended to run the clock, and intimidation pressure campaigns that are being used to wage an all-out assault on the results of the 2020 election. We are literally seeing one of the biggest post-election attempts to disenfranchise voters en masse in modern time. These post-election lawsuits are an affront to democracy. They are an attack on free and fair elections in our country. But we also see that these suits are diminishing the standing of American democracy on the world stage. The entire world is watching what is playing out here. And while the right to vote is under attack, we are also very confident that at the end of the day, democracy will prevail. The will of voters will prevail, that we will prevail in court, and that many of these suits will continue to be roundly dismissed or withdrawn. I also want to underscore the racial motivation underlying many of these lawsuits. The racial motivation is undeniable. President Trump and his allies have singled out jurisdictions with almost surgical precision that are home to large numbers of Black voters and voters of color. Thus, it's not accidental that the public conversation around these suits continues to focus on the Atlanta metropolitan area, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, Detroit, and other places that are again home to large numbers of voters of color. President Trump, Senator Lindsey Graham, and others also appear to be engaged in a dangerous campaign of intimidation against election officials. They are applying undue pressure on fellow Republicans to urge them to subvert the will of the people. Today, we know that Majority Leader Mike Shirkey from the Michigan Senate is meeting with President Trump. This is incredibly troubling. We know that earlier this week, there were reports that Senator Graham reached out to Georgia's Secretary of State, urging him to reject mail ballots cast by eligible voters. There were also conflicting reports about his contacts with other officials in Nevada and Arizona. We should not be seeing these kinds of pressure campaigns in our democracy today. The Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law has partnered with the NAACP, the Georgia People's Agenda, and Black voters in a number of states where these post-election lawsuits have been filed to intervene, to stand up to protect the rights of Black voters and voters of color. We're over now to Derek Johnson. Again, we have the privilege of representing the NAACP in a number of these post-election lawsuits to talk further about the implications for the NAACP, their members, and for Black voters in those parts of the country that are the subject of these lawsuits.
Thank you, Christian. And I want to thank the Lawyers Committee for the partnership as we were positioned to respond very quickly in the midst of the chaos that was intentionally being created by this administration. Chaos that was intentional in order to distract around the fact, not only the laws, but to distract around our ability to regroup or reorganize to focus on Georgia's January 5th runoff election cycle. Which is much more important than many people may realize. The Senate, in this context, will truly be the gatekeepers to determine whether or not we can put forth a progressive agenda that reflect the needs and interests of all Americans, a progressive agenda to address the global pandemic of COVID-19 so that we can finally get a federal response to this national health emergency. There's no way to do this effectively as a nation unless the federal government step in and begin to address this global pandemic. And in that backdrop, it begins to, for me, explain why would individuals who proclaim to love this nation, to love our Constitution, seek to subvert democracy, seek to delegitimize individuals who are citizens of this nation, have been citizens of this nation, have created the democracy that we lived in. They've served in the military armed forces, whether World War II, Korean War, Vietnam War, Desert Storm, and they participate to ensure that their franchise, their voices are heard. But this administration, who just 4 years ago, who asked the question, what do Black folks have to lose? And right now, it is being demonstrated more than ever. It is the stripping away of a franchise that far too many of us fought for. And when you look at the target jurisdictions, the city of Detroit, Wayne County, where I grew up, a city that's 80% African Americans, a city where the voters stood up in ways in which they needed to send a resounding message that we need to be a better nation, a more inclusive nation. The city of Philadelphia and Allegheny County of Pittsburgh, where voters stood up, Black, white, and across, to say we want a more forward-looking policy framework. The counties of Milwaukee and Dane County, that's overwhelmingly represented by communities of colors, particularly African Americans, under target, and the 9 counties in Metro Atlanta. We have an opportunity to begin to build and repair our democracy so we can look forward and not look back at a time that's more reminiscent of 1950. So what we are witnessing here is a direct subverting of democracy. And because the NAACP is able to partner with the Leadership Conference of Civil Rights, the Lawyers Committee, and many other groups, we must stand in unison to protect this democracy. But let us not be fooled. Just because we've seen victories in the courtroom, the fight isn't over. There will be a direct attempt to try to tamper with the Electoral College process. There will be a direct attempt to try to leverage legislative bodies not to rightfully seat electors from states that are entitled to be seated so that the Electoral College can finally put to rest the current political climate that has been germinating from the White House. We're nonpartisan, but we are political in the sense that we care about this country, we care about our democracy, and we will continue to fight to protect the rights for all citizens to cast an effective ballot. So I'm glad you pulled together this conversation so that we can continue to inform many of our constituency bases about where we are and what's going to be needed over the coming weeks as we continue to see attacks on our democracy. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Derek, and for the important work that you do to, in particular, protect and safeguard the rights of Black voters across our country. I want to turn next to Vanita Gupta to talk about the situation in Michigan, which is rapidly evolving, and to also talk about the consequences of not having an orderly transition and the kind of work that we continue to see happening inside the Senate.
Thank you so much, Kristen, for your leadership, for the Lawyers Committee's amazing work this election cycle and beyond, and to Derek as well for his leadership. This has been such a heavily coordinated effort across our organizations, and really because I think we've all understood the degree to which our democracy and our communities and communities of color in particular, their voting rights are so much at stake. So, you know, it bears repeating in this unprecedented time. When you look at the headlines in today's Washington Post and New York Times, you really have to take a moment to let them sink in when you're reading about what President Trump is trying to do. But in America, voters decide elections and politicians don't get to override their choices, no matter how they feel about the outcome. And as Kristen laid out, the Trump campaign's litigation is failing all over the country. I think as of last night, at least, it was like a 29-1 record. And the one win that the Trump campaign had was related to a very procedural win, but out to the Lawyers Committee, to the NAACP, and to other organizations for really holding the line on all of this. We have been coordinating on the communications front, supporting in-state advocates to do the work that they need to do, and ensuring that groups with mobilization power, voting groups in these states have the support that they need to ensure that all voters are able to have their votes counted and that we have a democracy at the end of all of this. Let me just pivot, because I think that Kristen has talked about what's at stake right now with the Georgia runoffs and with what the Senate is actually doing. We are seeing a holdup in the kind of lawful and orderly transfer of power, where the Biden transition team is being obstructed from key sources of information. The GSA is holding up ascertainment, a legal term of art that allows for the administration to get the resources, I think in this instance, just over $9 million to help support transition, but also access to vital national security and other information. Though they are going ahead with their planning and it isn't holding up on the Leadership Conference Coalition, reflecting the civil rights priorities and informing the shape of a Biden transition, as we do cyclically with key staff from the Lawyers Committee and the NAACP and other orgs. But right now, even this week, while Mitch McConnell and the Senate Republicans have failed actually to pass any COVID relief since March, the HEROES Act has been held up in the Republican Senate since May. We have seen that he continues to be single-mindedly focused on confirming judges. The lasting impact of this presidency are going to be the ways in which Trump has devastated basic tenets of our democracy, and for decades we will see this reflected on our federal judiciary. Quick overview: the president has had 227 of his lifetime judicial nominees confirmed, nearly 90% of them white, 76% of them male. And instead of working on COVID relief and other life-saving negotiations, McConnell continues to prioritize confirming more lifetime nominees. We all saw Amy Coney Barrett's confirmation rush through in 39 days right before in the lead up to the election. just this week, 5 more judicial nominees were confirmed, including Toby Kraus to the District of Kansas. Kraus is the Solicitor General of Kansas. He's advanced pretty egregious anti-civil rights arguments, including defending Kansas's discriminatory proof of citizenship law. We also saw Catherine Mizell to the middle, she's being sought for the Middle District of Florida. She is 33 years old. She was rated not qualified by the American Bar Association. And her record includes countless rollbacks on civil and human rights. This is an administration that has advanced some of the most egregiously anti-civil rights nominees who will serve for their lifetime, that will affect my children and our grandchildren's lifetimes. And they are moving with all swiftness to hold a hearing to replace and fill Amy Coney Barrett's seat on the 7th Circuit. This is a shameful record, and it is exactly why we need to make sure when we talk about the Georgia runoffs and we talk about this in ensuring that everyone will be able to cast their vote and have their vote counted, we understand what is at stake for civil rights with a Republican majority Senate. We are civil rights advocates. We do this work not in a nonpartisan fashion, but the makeup of the judiciary and what's been happening to our judges, all of our civil rights are at stake with our courts. And it is why it is so important for us to ensure that we have a pro-civil rights Senate in 2021 to really address and ensure that the important litigation that the Lawyers Committee and other litigating organizations do are able to have the kind of judges that will rule over this with fairness and with a respect for the rule of law and for civil rights for all people in this country. Thank you, Kristen.
Thanks, Vanita. Thanks for your important work and for continuing to push back on the lame duck nominations of judges in particular. I want to turn to Ezra Rosenberg now to comment further on the litigation landscape. But let me just remind folks that you can go ahead and enter your questions in the Q&A box. And Ezra, as you speak, I'm going to ask you to address this one question as well that has come in about the Electoral College vote. The question is, can the Electoral College vote opposite the people's vote? I know Vanita touched on this a bit, but I want to ask you to also elaborate.
Sure. Thanks, Kristen. And thanks for inviting me. It's an honor to be on this panel with you and Vanita and with President Johnson, and a particular honor for us to have been able to work with the NAACP in this important litigation in the post-election arena. I was thinking about what tone to strike here, because this should be a time when we're excited, when as Vanita was talking about transition, as we're preparing for a new administration. And unfortunately, when I talk to a lot of people, the tone and the feeling is just a certain amount of sadness that we're going through a period like this. But I'm hoping to be able to strike some points of optimism by the time I finish. The fact is that Trump and the Trump campaign and his allies and their use of the courts to challenge the results would be laughable, quite frankly, because of the frivolousness of the claims. Were it not that the purpose and effect is so pernicious and so dangerous. As Vanita mentioned, there have been some 30 suits that have been filed, and every one of them, with the one exception, and that one exception just got some very minor relief, which is on appeal, is not going to change any election result. Every one of them has either been dismissed, withdrawn, or is about to be dismissed. And what they've been doing has been filing a suit, withdrawing it, filing the same suit under a different name. It's like whack-a-mole, except I think it really gives moles a bad name, because as far as I know, moles don't file frivolous lawsuits, don't dissemble, don't discriminate on the basis of race, and don't try to make existential threats against democracy. And that's precisely what the Trump campaign has been trying to do. The purpose, and this goes to one of the questions in the chat, the purpose does not appear to win in court. And there's a question in the chat that says, what do you mean by running the clock, and what would be the benefit of doing that? one of the purposes is to run the clock, and the ostensible benefit is to get beyond what's called the safe harbor date of December 8th. And that's the date by which, if the governor of a state has certified the electors to the Electoral College, that certification and that slate cannot be challenged. And that goes to is somewhat to the question that you posed, Kristen, in terms of the Electoral College. We think that there is an extraordinarily strong defense against any attempt to overrule the rights of voters, the right and effect of voters in their selection of electors to the Electoral College. If the governor, in accordance with the state law that was set prior to the election, has certified, that really cannot be changed. And ultimately, if there were some dispute between the governor's choice and a legislative choice, the governor's choice has to be upheld under the Electoral College Act. So we do not think that there's any legitimate way that delay, getting beyond the safe harbor date, going to a state legislature to select a competing slate can be successful. The other purpose of what they're doing is even more dangerous, because that's really creating doubt as to the legitimacy of the election. And that is something that I think is going to haunt us for a long period of time. Now, we've been involved in about a third of the 30 suits that have been filed. 6 of those suits were voluntarily dismissed, including a couple after our intervention on behalf of the NAACP was granted. There are still 3 that are pending, one in Georgia that Kristen talked about, one in Pennsylvania that she talked about. All of them have basically argued the same broad issues. One of their ongoing themes is that the Republican Party was not given the right to observe the count. And court after court has ruled that just wasn't so. In fact, in one of the cases in the Eastern District of Pennsylvania, the judge specifically asked the lawyer for the Trump administration, did you have observers in the room? And his answer was, after being forced to finally answer, he said, we had a non-zero amount of observers in the room. And the court just threw out that case. Kristen mentioned the case that Giuliani argued in Pennsylvania this past week. And she focused on the fact that Giuliani specifically talked about the corruptness of cities where there is a predominantly Black population, of Philadelphia and Pittsburgh and Milwaukee and Detroit. The other thing that he did in that case, which was just astounding to me, he said, and this is a quote, absentee ballots are inherently fraudulent. Absentee ballots are inherently fraudulent. The way that more than half of the electorate chose to vote in this year of the pandemic, according to Giuliani speaking on behalf of the president's campaign, were inherently fraudulent. The good news is that by and large, our institutions have held firm. Government officials, including Republican officials like Brad Raffensperger and who's Secretary of State of Georgia, and believe me, we are not a longtime fan of Secretary Raffensperger. We probably have sued him more times than the Trump campaign has filed suits in post-election. But he has taken the right and virtuous stand that the voice of the electorate, the votes, are going to be what holds sway here, not political machinations. Similar statements have been made by leaders of the Republican Party in Michigan. Let's hope they hold true after they meet with the president today. And in Pennsylvania, where the Pennsylvania majority leader said that they would not, under any circumstances, overrule the voice of the people. And interestingly, many of the judges who have thrown out the cases are judges who were appointed by Republicans, including by President Trump. As Kristen mentioned, Judge Grimberg down in Georgia threw out the case. He was appointed by President by President Trump. Judge Ranjan, Pennsylvania, in the Western District, before election, threw out a case by the Republican Party. Judge Diamond in the Eastern District, appointed by a Republican president, threw out the case in the Eastern District. And Judge Brand in the Middle District of Pennsylvania, who has a case where Giuliani argued, seems to be looking at it precisely the way we would want him to look at it, which is fairly and objectively, and weighing what is really evidence and what is not evidence. So on the whole, we're extremely optimistic as to what's going to happen in litigation. Quite frankly, I'm even optimistic that were this to get to this Supreme Court, because this is not Bush versus Gore. This is not a situation where you had one state in play that had been decided by a few hundred votes. This is a situation when one candidate won the election by over 6 million votes by the time all is counted, where there are a half dozen states that make the difference, and they're not close elections in most of those states. And I do not think that this Supreme Court, or any court, with people who are looking at these issues with a modicum of objectivity, are going to want to go down in history as overruling the voice of the people, and go down as the grave diggers of our democracy.
Thanks.
Hello, everyone. This is Bahman Azad from the U.S. Peace Council. I will be moderating this important event. I just wanted to thank you first, before anything else, for taking your time to participate in this important webinar. As you all were aware, since last year, the opposition parties in Venezuela had created quite a lot of noise about the legitimacy of the Venezuelan government. They did everything they could, like organizing or trying protests and strikes, and encourage international sanctions, and even tried to stage a coup, and then mercenaries and everything else for the past year. And they have put their whole hope in the government of the United States to come in and help them to remove the Bolivarian government of Venezuela. Of course, this has failed, and now we are dealing with a new situation that the opposition parties are now very well fractured, and those who are following the Guaido efforts to sell the Venezuelan government and people to the United States have decided now to participate in the National Assembly elections that is coming up on December 6th. We are very fortunate that two of the leaders of the peace movement in Venezuela and the government, supporters of government of Venezuela are with us. They accepted our invitation to participate. We have a kind of a full list of speakers. I will get to that as we go forward. Well, on behalf of the organizers of this panel webinar, Simón Bolívar Institute for Peace and Solidarity Among Peoples, Committee for International Solidarity and the Struggle for Peace, U.S. Peace Council, and Canadian Peace Congress, I would like to welcome you to this webinar. We have a full list of speakers. We're going to start with our first two speakers from Venezuela. First will be Carlos Ron, President of Simón Bolívar Institute, followed by Gabriel Aguirre, General Secretary of Committee for International Solidarity and Peace in Venezuela. We're going to hear from them about the present situation, about the elections and what is going on in Venezuela right now. And then we will followed by other speakers. Carlos, please. Hello, everyone. This is Bahman Azad from the U.S. Peace Council. I I will be moderating this important event. I just wanted to thank you first before anything else for taking your time to participate in this important webinar. As you all were aware, since last year, the opposition parties in Venezuela had